Hi, I'm Tom Doyle, Associate Professor of Justice and Interim Director of the Fox Rothschild Center for Law and Society here at Community College of Philadelphia. Welcome to our Perspective series on CCP TV, the educational channel of Community College of Philadelphia. In this episode, Adjunct Professor David Trevaskis interviews Curry Bailey. Mr. Bailey is a school violence prevention expert and a principal trainer for Project Peace, the mediation, anti-bullying, and youth court program of the Pennsylvania Bar Association and the Pennsylvania Attorney General. Please enjoy what I'm sure you will find to be a very interesting and informative conversation.
Hello, I'm David Trevaskis, and I'm delighted to bring you to the Fox Rothschild Center for Law and Society's Perspectives series program. I serve as the pro bono coordinator of the Pennsylvania Bar, but I'm also an instructor at the Community College of Philadelphia, and I'm delighted to be here today to begin a series of conversations for the center on the issue of violence and how we're dealing with violence in our society. With me today is Curry Bailey, a school violence prevention specialist. And I'm going to start off by welcoming you, Curry, to the program. And just can you tell us a little bit about what is a school violence prevention specialist and how does somebody become one?
Sure. Well, the best definition of what a school violence prevention specialist is someone that supports schools in maintaining safe and nurturing learning environments. The best way to accomplish that is to look at how we can best engage the child and their family in the day-to-day operations of the school. A lot of the violence that takes place in our schools is because our young people feel disconnected. They don't feel involved. They don't feel a part of the school climate, the school family. You cited an example to me about when you visit a school and you see trash on the floor and people just walk by that trash and they don't pick it up. Now that might seem like a minor thing, but that is an indication that the people in the school have not taken ownership of that school, so they won't bend down to pick up the piece of trash. To answer the second part of your question, how does a person become involved in this field? Well, I'll use myself as an example. My background dealt a lot with the children that were at risk. You know, I worked in a facility that was a child and adolescent psychiatric hospital. I worked for 11 and a half years in brain injury. So I saw the outcome of effects of children not being able to resolve their conflicts peacefully. So for me, I was able to take that background information so that when I started with the school district, I already had some type of ideal or some type of sense how people ended up in emergency rooms, how people ended up in funeral parlors. And if you take it back to the beginning part of that conversation, there were things that could occur in a school that we could teach children to do and their families, just like we teach them math, just like we teach them reading, just like we teach them languages. We can also teach them the language of peace. We can teach them the language of peaceful conflict resolution.
Very, very interesting. Now, I understand that you are doing work as a trainer, one of the principal trainers for the Project Peace program. And Project Peace is the Peaceful Endings Through Authorities, Children and Educators project of the Pennsylvania Bar Association and the state's Attorney General's office. That's a program that's been here in Pennsylvania since Michael Fisher was Attorney General in 1999. And I know everyone is very excited about the historic election of the first Democrat and first female to be elected to the office of Attorney General, Kathleen Kane. This Project Peace program has three elements, as I understand it. It has a peer mediation component, an anti-bullying component, and a youth court component. I know from your personal background that you're an expert in each of those areas, but can you talk a little bit about each of the three areas for us? And why don't we start first with mediation? What is mediation? How does that work in the schools? And what is your role as a person who comes into the schools to train young people about mediation and to work with young people?
My background in mediation stems from my time in the school district as a violence prevention specialist. we were tasked with the assignment of finding programs that could help schools maintain safe and peaceful and nurturing learning environments. I tripped on mediation. I went to a training at Good Shepherd Mediation program. And I saw the power of being able to train students to mediate conflict themselves. So having students trained in the art of mediation could take some of the burden off of the staff to constantly be putting out disputes, to constantly be putting out fights among students. But as I entered into doing training for mediation, my thought was, well, gee, does this really work? It works in a training, but could it actually work in actual schools? Well, lo and behold, after I'd done the trainings in the schools, I returned to the schools sometime later, only to be met with, can you train more of our students? How do we get, more of this? So it's not a question of whether mediation works. The question always is, will the schools allow their students to do the mediations? Tying it into the project piece. Over the last couple of years, Project Peace has kind of branched out. So now we have a couple of charter schools that are implementing the program. Greenwood's Environmental Charter School, Richard Allen Global Charter School. I've been involved with them for about 3 years. They have very ambitious mediation programs there, where every year that I return, I'm always training additional students. What the programs allow the schools to do is to focus more so on the instruction and less on the behavior aspect, because the mediators become the role models, they become the leaders in the schools. So you have the formal mediations that are taking place, but you also have the informal mediations. So obviously the formal mediation is teacher makes a referral, student makes a referral, parent makes a referral, that gee, we need the dispute resolved before it blows into something bigger. Then you have the informal mediation. Mediators sitting in the lunchroom and they reach over and say, yo man, don't do that. They look over and say, why don't you chill, man? Why don't you take it easy? So they're able to embody the tenets of mediation outside of the scope of the mediation sessions. You also mentioned bullying prevention as part of Project Peace. What's happened in the past is we've had this really antiquated, primitive method of dealing with bullying. Bully starts to bully. We figure the best way to resolve that is to heap more bullying on the bully. Well, the research shows that doesn't work, because through the Oveus program, which you are one of the trainers of, you can appreciate that, there's this theater that's taking place. The theater involves 3 actors: the target, the bully, and the bystander. So an introduction to bullying prevention allows for information to be disseminated so that the schools recognize that there's 3 actors in this theater, and that unless you identify who those actors are and what is the best way to deal with each of those roles, the bullying will continue to persist. So it's really a more educated, a more enlightened way of dealing with bullying prevention.
Let me see and interject here. So you're saying that the mediation is something that the kids do themselves?
Yes.
They can work out problems. And is it something that's mandated? Are they forced into mediation, or is it something that's voluntary?
For mediation to be most effective, it has to be voluntary. But schools sometimes implement what they call the laissez-faire, passive-aggressive form of volunteerism. That, you don't have to go, but you might get suspended for a week. So in which case, is it really voluntary? Well, it still is, because they still have to commit to it, but still buzzing in the back of their head is, well, gee, if I get suspended, my mom's going to get after me. So, yes, it's voluntary.
But that program, they work out their disputes, they come to some sort of resolution, and the school isn't involved anymore in it, right?
No. The only way the school will become involved anymore is if the problem comes back up again.
Okay, but now this bullying, and this is one of the interesting things. You mentioned Daniel Oveus, the Oveus Bullying Prevention Program. Dr. Oveus has always been anti-mediation because of that sort of well-meaning adult who pressures the kid into mediation when the problem wasn't just a conflict between individuals, but the problem was some sort of bullying. And if I understand it correctly, the difference is when it's a conflict between individuals, we have a relationship that ultimately we want to restore. We have a balance of power between us. When it's bullying, there is no relationship and there is no balance of power. It's really about abuse. So what happens in schools that are doing the Project Peace program with the bullying? Do they send the bullies to mediation?
Well, you raise a couple of interesting points. Ovea states that you can't use mediation in instances of bullying. Well, I think there are certain exceptions to that. So for one, when mediators go into mediation, they take things into consideration. So while it might not be an issue with bullying, maybe one of the individuals in the mediation is more outspoken than the others. Well, the mediator is going to take stock of that and make certain adjustments. One of the things that the mediators are able to do is something called a caucus, where they're able to meet with each person that's come to the mediation individually, just to find out perhaps what their needs are in order to complete the mediation successfully. So I wouldn't necessarily say exclusively that you couldn't use mediation during cases of bullying, because it kind of converts in a way from maybe mediation to a conversation. So the mediators are able to support the person that's the target of the bullying to express how they're feeling, but also kind of mute the impact of the bully as they respond. I've gone to schools and I've said, well, you know, when you went through the training, I really recommended that only under certain circumstances you use mediation in cases of bullying. There's some schools that use it all the time, because the mediator said, well, you know, mister, I know he's a bully. You know, I'm not going to let him run roughshod over the person that's in there. You know, there's certain rules they have to follow, you know, to keep the mediation, you know, going forward. So I think that if we keep those things in mind as we're doing this program, because if you don't, yeah, then you're wreaking more havoc on the target of the bullying. They're being re-victimized all over again.
And this actually goes to the question you said about the voluntary nature of the mediation. If it's truly voluntary and the kid who's the target agrees to go to mediation,
Sure.
that kid is making a choice.
Yes.
And if they don't want to be in the room with the bully and it's truly voluntary, they can stay away.
Sure.
But if it's forced by the adults, that's when the problems occur. Is that what you're saying?
Well, what's interesting is when I worked in the district, I personally never did a mediation, AKA conversation, with a bullying victim without the parents being there. In my experience, it was always the parent of the victim that wanted to sit down with the bully and the parent of the bully. You know, never had that turn out poorly.
It's interesting, the situation you're describing is very akin to the victim offender mediations
Sure.
that we see in the justice system.
Sure.
It also goes to an important concept that I know is part of Project Peace, which is the adult-directed mediation.
Yes.
And so
Yes.
you're saying in these bullying situations, you've actually, as the adult, directed a process that uses the mediation techniques
Yes.
to resolve it.
Yes.
And would that be the suggestion you would have for most bullying situations as the most effective way?
Absolutely, because I think that, you know, having the adults involved, you know, being trained and what to look out for, being trained in the process, because the actual conversation that takes place is the end game. Prior to that, you got the investigation. You know, you got the conversation. You know, you're gathering data to find out if it's even appropriate to sit down and to do this. So in the cases I've been involved with, they've always done that, so that when we got to that end game part, it really went well. It was really interesting in a lot of those cases where the bully found out that their parent, when they were a child, was a victim themselves.
Wow.
You know, and when I start off that statement, people try to end it for me, and they'll say, well, the bully found out that their mother was a bully herself. I said, no. You know, when you look at the bully's face in the session, and the mother is saying, you know, those girls that taunted me in high school and, you know, wouldn't sit at the lunchroom table with me, who didn't speak to me at the prom, all those are instances of bullying. That's what your mother went through. And now you're sending some child, you know, through that. So that was very enlightening for me. So I thought that maybe parents who are victims of bullying, maybe they never shared it with their children. Or maybe subconsciously they communicate a message that I was picked on, you better make sure that you're not picked on, you know.
It's interesting. And taking a step back, these programs sound wonderful, the mediation, the anti-bullying, but with this era of high-stakes testing and the push on schools to make annual, yearly progress and all the pressure that's on schools, when do they find the time to do something like this?
Well, I always thought the notion of lacking time was ludicrous. Fight breaks out in the lunchroom. You don't say, well, the bell rang, let's send the kids to the next class, right?
No, we don't.
You take the participants that were part of that fight, you remove them, you do a process, and you usually suspend them. That's what happens. However long it takes to find out who was involved and suspend them. You can spend that same time doing the mediation.
Before you have the fight?
Before you have the fight, yeah.
It's interesting because in preparing for today and looking at some of the research, there is a body of research which says that schools that implement these programs do better on their mandating testing. And it seems to be that the theory is exactly what you're describing, that if kids feel safe and kids feel calm, they can focus on the schools. This idea of suspension that you just mentioned, though, we have a new administration coming into the school district. They're here. They're doing away with zero tolerance.
So they say.
So they say. And I know there's always a disconnect between what the central administration is announcing and what's happening in the individual buildings. But this goes to the third prong of Project Peace, which is the youth courts. And can you talk a little bit about youth courts as an alternative to suspension and what's your sense about them?
I became more knowledgeable about youth court this past year working at Germantown High School. At the time that I left Germantown High, they had just finished training their students for youth court. It's a very interesting concept because it gives a larger group of students involvement with consequences and discipline as it relates to infractions that their fellow students participate in. So, for example, a student has a conflict with a teacher. Maybe they curse at them, maybe they just disrespect them. That student is sent to youth court. That situation is told in a story and a narrative to the youth court participants, the jury. And then they discuss what the possible response should be to that student's behavior. But what's interesting is that as I observed the training of it, and I assumed the training is comparable to the implementation, just like the training and mediation is comparable to implementation, all the things they considered. So they knew that that particular teacher maybe had a certain irk about him, that you can't raise your voice to that teacher, or you can't come in late. So they factored that in maybe to why that student responded the way that they do. But they also looked at that student's particular situation, that the student is now maybe in a homeless shelter, and they have moved further away from school, and it's taken them longer to get to school. So they do really consistently what the adults are supposed to do, but don't. Consider all the aggravating and mitigating factors before they dole out the consequence. But what's interesting about it is once they dole it out, obviously the person receiving it has to acknowledge that they'll accept it and carry it out. But then that person is now tied in the youth court because they got to put in X amount of hours in youth court as a juror. So it's a very friendly, nurturing, vicious cycle that keeps bolstering and building up the youth court concept and process as well as the participants. So I see this as another useful tool for schools to use to reduce out-of-school suspension, but more importantly, to increase and enhance student engagement.
This restorative nature of these youth courts is really one of their strong selling points. But one of the questions that always comes up is, do the kids actually decide whether somebody's guilty of an infraction? How do these courts run in terms of those procedures?
Well, what's interesting is, and if schools can ever move to this point, they will enter the world of enlightenment. That students give you a lot of BS, they give you a lot of drama, because there's this stigma to being wrong, to have erred, to have did something bad. Youth court takes all that away. Okay, tell me you did it, let's move on.
So the student says, I did it.
Yes.
And then instead of being suspended or other discipline, they go
Yes.
before the youth court.
Yeah.
And this group of other students who've been trained, they listen to them? Are there adults in the room? Are there lawyers there? Are there judges? How does this all work?
Well, there's two models with youth court. There's the traditional model that has a defense attorney, AKA a student support liaison person, and a prosecutor. But even in that setting, it isn't that, the student did what they did, so that person might be there just to accentuate the mitigating factors. But then you have the more restorative practice form of youth court where you don't have a prosecutor. You just have a person in there advocating for the person that's involved in infraction. And what can we do to best serve this person's, best interest?
And are these students or adults in all these roles?
These are students.
Okay, and I think that's an essential part of the Project Peace model, that the more student involvement,
Yes.
the better. I know there are some models around the country which actually use real judges.
Sure.
There are adults in other roles, but the Project Peace model that's being promoted across the state is calling for youth engagement.
Yes.
And you said something about the students who are actually the respondents coming to youth courts, the ones who actually committed the violations of the school policies. They then serve on the youth court and sort of sit in judgment of their peers, other kids?
Yeah, and I think that's a great way to approach it, because now you're building empathy. First that child was on one side of the ledger. They was the one that maybe told somebody to commit a biological impossibility. Now they're in the jury box hearing somebody else having done that and coming up with maybe reasons why they did it beyond what they're saying and what some of the remedy of that, could be. So I think that by doing that, because you oftentimes hear people say a lot of the infractions that take place is because our children lack empathy. Well, that might be true, but I think the more so it's the issue of them not having the opportunity to practice empathy. We want them on guard. We want them in this very geared up manner where they're always, preparing for the attack. But if you can have more empathy operating, then they're looking at both sides of it. So if both of the combatants are looking at both sides of it, maybe it's never a combat. Maybe there's a conversation.
And it does seem to be a consistent theme of your work and of Project Peace that we want people to converse, to talk about problems instead of resorting to fighting.
Absolutely. When you look at where the problems lie, and you can see it real clear in a mediation session, you can see it real clear in the youth court, it's that the opportunity or the ability to put feelings into words, when that breakdown takes place, it's got to go somewhere. So it's going to come out some other kind of way, so that the students are building a better repertoire of skills, they're building up their vocabulary, but also being comfortable with those repertoire skills and vocabulary, so that if you're in a lunchroom and somebody calls your name, you know how to play that. So I know one of my colleagues, Myrna Shaw, in her program, I Can Problem Solve, she talks about this boy that was real fat, and he had a problem with people teasing him. So he's in a lunchroom one time, and the boy calls him, "You're nothing but a big piece of bacon." And he looks at it and says, "That's because I sizzle." And that just diffused everything that was going on. So that was the way he decided to do it. There was probably another response to that. So unless we're able to teach our young people these different responses, they can't be in a Brooks Brothers suit in the courtroom. They can't be in the operating room, because the conflict pops up no matter what your occupation or your profession happens to be. How you handle that in a large part is going to determine, are there going to be next steps available to you? That's why at this point in time in our country's history, to have the type of president that we have that has endured all type of insults and all types of just scandalous statements made to him, he always handles it in a way that people will kind of quietly say, yeah, that's how I want to handle it. That's how I want my child to handle it, because maybe they become president of the United States.
That's an exciting thing. You did mention Myrna Shore and the I Can Problem Solve. I'd like to just follow up on that for a moment, because her program deals with students even before they get to school. Project Peace is really coordinating teaching conflict resolution to the younger children in kindergarten and beyond, and then doing peer mediation starting around 3rd or 4th grade?
Yeah, yes.
And then when do the anti-bullying education starts?
Well, that should have started in pre-K.
Okay, so that
Really?
starts also there.
Yeah,
and then youth courts, is that something they can start in the elementary
Yes,
school?
it can. Yes, it can. Absolutely.
So wow, so you have these programs going on. But Myrna Shore's program, I Can Problem Solve, which I know you've incorporated some of her things,
Yes.
even though she was for preschool students. And
Yeah, basically her program was up to 5th grade.
Up to 5th grade, pre-kindergarten to up to 5th grade.
Yes.
And you've incorporated some of that even into your high school work. But talk a little bit about her model and how there are so many good models out there that we need to embrace. It seems to me that the answer's out there, it's just that people have to listen to the answer.
Sure.
What do you think?
Well, what's interesting about I Can Problem Solve is kind of like the genesis of it. Myrna Shore partnered with a guy, Dr. Spivak, and they really collaborated.
And they're here at Drexel in Philadelphia,
Yeah.
right?
What was interesting was Spivak was working at Devereaux, and this boy ran away from the residential site one Sunday. They captured him, brought him back. So part of I Can Problems, he had a conversation with him, like, why did you run away? He said, well, I ran away because I wanted to go to town because I got some additional money and I wanted to go shopping. Well, what store did you want to go to? And he named store X store, Y store, Z. He said, you realize that at the time you arrived in town, they were closed. He said, yeah, I got it. So as he's talking to this boy, he's realizing he gave no forethought to what he did, gave no forethought to the consequences that might come out from what he did. Essentially, it was those type of issues with children that was the genesis of I Can Problem Solve. So there's an actual script that's included in I Can Problem Solve that the two of us would go through if we're having a conflict. But the lessons in I Can Problem Solve go over perspective taking, go over considering consequences, go over alternatives to certain type of behaviors. I'm giving you really a thumbnail sketch of what I Can Problem Solve is. How I've used it in my programs. This is a conversation I had with Myrna Shore when I first met her. I said, I want to use your program for some 8th grade bullies in middle school. She said, well, you can't use it for them because it's not researched for middle school. I said, you're thinking about them chronologically. I'm thinking about them developmentally. So they're in 8th grade, they're operating at a 5th grade level. Yes, the areas in I Can Problem Solve are the areas they missed. So I took this curriculum and I used it with these boys. So Myrna was constantly interested in, well, did they think it was corny? Did they think it was childish? They loved it. So as part of that had to do with the people that were presenting. It was myself and a young lady named Carmen Santiago from the GEAR program. But part of it was, these are the things that children thirst for. Children thirst for the things they lack. They don't know what they lack, but they know they lack something. So they're constantly in pursuit of that. That's when the drugs, that's when the sex, that's when the violence comes in, because momentarily it meets that need, or those people that are participating in those activities meet those needs. So there are a lot of programs out there that could be used for other age categories. I'm a big proponent of taking a program, maybe research for a lower grade, and using it upper, not the other way around. That's when I found to be more effective. So I Can Problem Solve as research from pre-K to 5. I can say use it from 5 and upgrades, incorporated it. And when I used it, I also incorporated service learning. That's another thing that schools should really advocate a lot more of. You know, you find students will pick a topic. They might pick a topic of homelessness. They might pick a topic of SID, sudden infant death syndrome. I know one school one time picked that as a topic because their 5th grade teacher, their baby died. And when the teacher came back and talked about the circumstances, they decided they wanted to do research about that. If you take the combination of a project piece with these type of programs, as well as with an I Can Problem Solve with the service learning, yeah, you put people like me out of business. I'd be running around schools like, ain't you having any problems? Say, yeah, we are, but we're handling it. We got because the problems are going to be there. Conflict is a part of life. It's not going anywhere. So the challenge isn't to eradicate conflict. The challenge is to eradicate the nonsensical ways adults as well as students deal with the conflict.
That's all the time we have here for today. I want to thank my guest, Curry Bailey, for joining us and sharing his expertise. And Curry, I also want to thank you for the wonderful work you do in our schools with our young people. And I want to thank all of you watching for tuning in. You have been watching the Fox Rothschild Center for Law and Society's Perspective series on CCP TV, the educational channel of the Community College of Philadelphia. I'm David Trevaskis, adjunct professor in the Paralegal Studies program. For more information, contact us here at the college. See you next time on CCP TV.